We also do a tremendous amount of local programming, teaching nonviolent conflict resolution to young people and adults, and we have a wonderful program for teenagers called the Richmond Peace Project. Thank you all so much for being here tonight for this very important community discussion about Syria, alternatives to military intervention and prospects for peace. We are very fortunate to have with us speakers Michael Fishbach and Gerald Weiler, and I'll introduce them both officially in just a minute. But I first just wanted to quickly and sincerely thank the wonderful First Unitarian Universalist Church of Richmond for hosting us here tonight in our great hall. We have such appreciation for this wonderful faith community and all that you all do, so thank you so much for having us. I also wanted to ask, we understood that there might be a representative from Congressman Bobby Scott's office here tonight, but no one has tapped me on the shoulder. No? Okay. And John Knapp? No, not yet. A staffer from Bobby Scott's office indicated that they tried to come, and a staffer from his office may have just walked in. Lastly, I just wanted to mention that this program, like so much of what the Peace Center does, we are offering for free to the community, and we do have a donation box at the front, and we very much welcome goodwill offerings to help offset the cost from this event, as well as our other free programs. Thank you for making a contribution after the event. And I just wanted to acknowledge that John Knapp from there. We have John Knapp with us this evening, who is, I believe, State Director for Senator Tim Kaine. Thank you, John, so much for being here with us and for listening and for sharing with the Senator some of what you hear tonight. Thank you so much for being here. I want to just open by acknowledging the perhaps obvious observation that we stand tonight at what is, in some ways, an unexpected and for many of us a very welcome moment, in that just 3 short weeks ago, our country really did appear to be poised to engage in airstrikes against Syria. I remember seeing news headlines one Tuesday in late August that read, "Military strikes on Syria as early as Thursday," and official sources were suggesting that President Obama was leaning strongly towards strikes and was preparing for a 3-day-long air bombardment to punish Syrian President Bashar al-Assad for chemical weapons use. And it has been remarkable to witness our country jump from this path toward direct military confrontation to a path that looks much different, a path of serious engagement in international problem-solving and diplomacy, which culminated in this week's U.S.-Russia agreement on a framework and a timeline for the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons. And so this time, we succeeded in averting a rush to war. It was remarkable to witness our elected leaders really engage in a real discussion about the appropriate role of U.S. military force and the appropriate role of the U.S. in the Middle East. And it was refreshing that after 12 long years of our really rushing headlong into wars and military confrontation in the Middle East, that we as a country paused and had that discussion, and to see President Obama, under threat of the Congress's vote to vote against authorization of the use of military force in Syria, to see President Obama in fact embrace the Russian plan on chemical weapons and send Senator Kerry to Geneva, where he and his counterparts worked out this framework. So I just wanted to sort of acknowledge this perhaps changed moment. Now, on the other hand, the Syrian civil war, which has cost upwards of 100,000 lives and displaced about 1/3 of the Syrian population, continues. And on the other hand, also, the very global superpowers that are engaging in a diplomatic solution on chemical weapons are also the very parties who are in fact actively fueling the fires of this terrible civil war. Both Russia and the United States, as well as other outside parties, are actively supporting opposing sides of the civil war with arms and resources. So tonight we will be exploring all of that complexity, and we'll hear tonight about some of the history behind the current conflict, where things really stand now, U.S. involvement, and possibilities for peace. very warm welcome to our two speakers this evening who will help us shed some light, much needed light on this current crisis. First, Dr. Michael Fischbach, and I think I'll just introduce you both and then hand the floor over to you. Dr. Michael Fischbach is Professor of History at Randolph-Macon College in Ashland, Virginia, received his doctorate in modern Middle Eastern history from Georgetown University. He frequently addresses international conferences, the media, and has been a consultant for Middle Eastern negotiators in the Library of Congress, the United Nations Development Program, and the International Development Research Center. He's been a great resource to us at the Richmond Peace Education Center, and always sheds much light with his historical analysis and his ability to sort of place these contemporary conflicts into a historical and a regional context. We're so happy to have Dr. Fischbach back with us once again. We also have with us tonight J. Darrell Byler, who is the new director of the Center for Justice and Peacemaking at Eastern Mennonite University, which, by the way, is a truly extraordinary resource located just 2 hours away in Harrisonburg. And from 2007 until, I believe, just a few months ago, Darrell Byler lived in Amman, Jordan, served as the regional representative for the Mennonite Central Committee there, and in this capacity he worked with local NGO partners in Iran, Iraq, Jordan, and Israel-Palestine on a variety of humanitarian assistance, development, and peacebuilding projects, including supporting programs directly serving Syrian refugees. He wrote the September 5th op-ed in the Richmond Times-Dispatch titled "Don't Strike," which advocated non-military international interventions instead of strikes on Syria. And I had a number of different RPAC members call me up, beginning with Guy Kidman, who's here somewhere, there's Guy, who's both a member of the Peace Center and a member of this church, at bringing my attention to this article. And this article just clearly had a tremendous resonance with a lot of people in the Richmond community. And when we read it, many of us here at RPAC thought we really need to get Darrell Byler here to share with us in person. So thank you so much for making the time tonight, and thank you both so much for being here. Michael Fischbach will begin by giving some historical background and context, and then Darrell Byler will present about his time in the Middle East and prospects for peace, and will share some slides with us as well. Then we will have plenty of time for questions and answers and discussions with both of these gentlemen. So Michael, the floor is yours, and you can come up here or you can run up here.
Thanks, Adria. You're always so kind in your introductions. I recognize myself in some of that, but I'll take it. Good evening, and thank you so much for coming. It's always a source of inspiration to me to see that there are Americans who are concerned about foreign policy, and particularly concerned about the United States' often not only stated but actual use of military force. And so I'm glad to see you tonight. I'm reminded of something that a Palestinian friend of mine once said. He said, the question I'd like to ask Americans is, why does your country start so many wars? And for a country where the average person says that peace is very, very important, it is something to ponder, that far more than any other country in the past 60 years. These ours that have started so many conflicts, and certainly we're in the midst of that national soul searching now. What I'd like to do as a historian tonight is to put some of this in a context. Because I find many of the people who really are wrestling with the decision about, well, what should the United States do in Syria are people like you, people of good conscience, people who are seriously concerned about humanitarian issues, and questions such as how to stop a war, or what about weapons of mass destruction. These are the things that motivate the hearts of sincere people. What I'm arguing is that, unfortunately, I don't think that those kinds of issues have anything to do with the proposal to attack Syria. That in fact there are deeper, more basic, more strategic interests that the United States is concerned with. And much like we were told in 2002, in the run-up to the Iraq War, the real reasons for a war, in this instance in Syria, have much more to do with those kinds of strategic interests than they do with things like regime change, getting rid of dictators, bringing democracy, stopping the spread of weapons of mass destruction. These are things that our government knows will touch people's hearts and help get on board with something that is fundamentally about very different issues. And as we saw in the case of Iraq, it really wasn't about regime change. It really wasn't about bringing democracy. And might I add, if we were really going to bring democracy to the Middle East, let's start with Saudi Arabia. No constitution, no elections, but really about other things. And to explain more about what these other strategic issues are that I think are really underlying what this country is doing in Syria, I'd like us to imagine that we fell asleep and woke up in the 19th century. In fact, in about the years, let's say 1830 or so. In 1830 and 31, the regions that today we call Syria were invaded and occupied by a very ambitious ruler in Egypt named Muhammad Ali, who, while technically a governor in the Ottoman Empire, was effectively his own ruler. And Muhammad Ali expanded his rule in Egypt into the Syrian provinces, today what we call Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. Muhammad Ali's goal was eventually to become independent from the Ottomans. And to do that, he needed an army. To get an effective modern army, he needed taxes, and he needed economic growth in Egypt, all of which he accomplished with a remarkable program of industrialization. There were railroads built in Egypt in the 1800s before there were railroads in places like Sweden. He built factories, he set up state monopolies, not really socialism, but state monopolies. He began exporting vast amounts of cotton and prohibiting the import of British cotton cloth. Now what I'm getting at is that it was very clear to the British government, which was industrializing, that they now had a very serious trade rival and a very serious and powerful Middle Eastern rival on the communication routes to India. Whereas the Ottoman government had been very pliant, Muhammad Ali was now very clearly a threat. And so, not surprisingly, in 1838, putting down as he was this lingering uprising in Syria that his occupation had caused. There was a rebellion in Syria against Muhammad Ali and the Egyptians. In 1838, he announced that he really wanted to become independent, whereupon the British promptly said that it would support the Ottoman Empire. And Britain played a leading role in calling a conference in London in 1840 that said that the Allies were going to decide the issue. They weren't going to leave it up to the Ottomans to defeat Muhammad Ali, because they couldn't. And lo and behold, that fall, in the fall of 1840, British forces landed in what is today Lebanon. Other European forces landed and began providing arms to the Syrian rebels, working with them to overthrow Muhammad Ali, and eventually parked a large naval fleet off the coast of Alexandria and forced Muhammad Ali into submission. What does it have to do with Syria? Well, it has to do in that, now nearly 200 years later, we find another Syrian uprising against a dictatorship, and suddenly we find outside powers suddenly deciding that they care about these Syrian rebels, and oh, what a terrible dictator there is, and we're going to come in and help you get rid of him. A remarkably similar storyline. But what was motivating Lord Palmerston and the British government in 1840 was not concern for what was going on really in Syria. It was the need to get rid of a very serious strategic rival to British interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, one that was hurting British industry, British commerce, and potentially poised to mess up British communication lines with India. This pattern of Western intervention to preserve very fundamental strategic, by that I mean economic, I mean trade and transportation, to protect strategic Western interests has played itself out time and time again since that episode in 1840. For example, when an uprising in Egypt threatened to overthrow the local ruler, who was quite cozy with the British, in 1882, the British landed troops and occupied Egypt, and stayed there in one form or another until 1956. During the First World War, despite its neutrality, Iran was invaded both by the Russians and by the British as part of their global struggle against Germany. And I might add that the same thing happened again in the Second World War. British, Soviet troops invaded neutral Iran. It was too important to leave, quote unquote, unprotected. And many Americans forget that during the Tehran conference with Franklin Roosevelt, that was Churchill and Stalin. I think a lot of Americans have never asked the question, yeah, how did they pick Tehran of all places to meet in? Well, they had occupied the Iranian capital. Okay. Yet more examples. During the Second World War, Britain reinvaded Iraq. It was simply too important to leave to a pro-German sympathizing local government. And perhaps some of the most famous examples of what I've talked about have occurred even more recently. In 1951, when the Iranian government nationalized a British oil company in Iran, instead, all the profits would go for the Iranian people. Britain engineered a worldwide boycott of Iranian oil, and working with the Eisenhower administration, the Truman administration of the Eisenhower administration, the CIA worked to overthrow the Prime Minister Mosaddegh, reinstate the Shah, who of course was a very pliant ally of the United States in preserving American interests and British interests in that oil-rich country. Similarly, in the 1950s, the Egyptian president Jamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company. In the summer of 1956, the United States, and particularly again Britain, France, and other countries began talking about a dictator, and this dictator can choke the world's oil supply. Of course, the whole reason Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal was to allow ships to go through and be able to get the tolls. But the world was told he can close off the oil, and a mere several months later, in 1956 in October, British, French, and Israeli forces invaded Egypt in an attempt to overthrow Nasser and capture the canal. And of course, we know that U.S. and British forces were sent to Jordan and Lebanon in 1958, that the United States later sent troops to Lebanon in 1983, and of course, lest we forget the long and complicated history that our countries had with Iraq. I myself have found archival documents in Washington that show that the Army knew that Iraq had used weapons of mass destruction, poison gas, as early as 1963. This was a 1968 Army document. We, of course, knew that Saddam Hussein was using chemical weapons against his own population in the north, the Kurds, as well as Iranians during the war, with Mary Limber. But suddenly, after oil-rich Kuwait was invaded by Iraq, suddenly this became an issue. In a sense, the elder Bush made it fairly clear that this was about oil. We had none of this distracting talk we heard 10 years ago or even today about humanitarian interests. What I'm getting at, to bring it to a conclusion, is that the present situation in Syria, while people of good conscience really do see it as a question of what can the world do in a post-Holocaust world, a post-Rwanda world, none of us feel comfortable just watching people of a country kill themselves. The questions ought to be, well, is war going to help end the war? As David and I like to say, war itself is the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. But even putting that entire discussion aside about what to do on a humanitarian level, I think it's imperative for the American people to see that fundamentally what's going on in Syria has nothing to do with that. It is part of a much longer process of the United States and other powerful outsiders to that region trying to shape the region to suit their own needs. It's a very important part of it. It always has been. It's where Europe, Africa, and Asia come together. And this was important to countries long before the discovery of oil, but now it's even more important. Okay, why Syria? Why now? Why this issue? If you look at the longer historical context, and I've tried to spell it out, you see that this is outside powers want to change some government with an uppity leader who's telling the West where to go, and we can't tolerate that. What is going on in Syria today is fundamentally about sending a message to Iran. It is fundamentally about reassuring allies like Turkey and Israel. It is about trying to get away, to do away with a regime like Iraq that has long posed various strategic problems to the U.S. and Israel. And Syria, and the talk of intervention to stop barbarous crimes, however heinous those are, is really not what this is about. And so I would just caution those who are still undecided how they feel to realize that this context is there, whether we like to see it or not. And certainly Middle Easterners of all political stripes understand this long history of Western intervention and frankly take a very cynical view of Western countries talking about suddenly discovering the humanity involved, the suffering humanity, and what we must do to intervene. So I hope that this brief history lesson has helped place the context of this, and certainly has helped defend the position that I'm arguing here, which is that this really is not about humanitarian concerns. It is about much more basic, boring, everyday political and strategic interests in that very important part of the world. So I look forward to our question and answer session, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I want to, first of all, express gratitude that my colleague, Phoebe Kilby, is here with me from the Center for Justice and Peace Building. And she set up a table in the rear if you want to learn a bit more about our center in Harrisburg. We want to pick up some resources. Michael has done a great job of setting the stage. I feel like I'm back in the Middle East listening to you because when you would ask someone in the Middle East a question, they would say, well, to answer that, we need to start in the first century. So the answers were always more complex than what you imagine. My premise this evening is that after two costly wars during the last decade, many ordinary folks in this country feel fatigued and skeptical about additional military engagements, and that there may be fresh domestic openness to imagine creative, nonviolent alternatives to military strikes. I want to begin by sharing a personal, on-the-ground perspective of working with Syrian refugees who have fled into Jordan to escape the violence from Syria. Those who have lived in international settings are aware of the saying that if you travel to another country for a week, you feel competent to write a book. If you stay for a month, you maybe feel comfortable writing a chapter. If you stay for a whole year, you might be convinced to write a short article. After living in the Middle East for the last 6 years and experiencing the complexities of the region, I no longer feel confident that I can even write a good footnote. So I am sharing my reflections tonight with a great deal of humility. As Adria said, my wife and I spent the last 6 years in Amman, Jordan, working as regional representatives for Mennonite Central Committee, or MCC. Our role was to oversee MCC's programs throughout a number of countries in the region. And so we traveled extensively from Iran to Israel. And spent a lot of time visiting with local partners and seeing the projects that they were doing and listening to local perspectives. During the past 2 years, a major focus of MCC's work in Jordan was responding or supporting local organizations who were responding to the Syrian refugees who were flooding into the country. According to the United Nations, there are now more than 2 million Syrian refugees living in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt. Indeed, the UN estimates that by the end of this year, 1/2 of the population of Syria will be either displaced inside Syria or refugees in neighboring countries like Jordan. That means 10 million Syrians potentially uprooted from their homes. This picture is of a mass exodus into Kurdistan in northern Iraq. I'd like to just share a few pictures and stories to set the